although it's a good thing, I would argue, that there is a greater emphasis from the consumer's perspective on the environmental sustainability of the fish. So, for example, you have the Marine Stewardship Council label, the blue tick that goes on the sides of fish and so on. The problem with that is that it has absolutely no significance for working conditions. So, perhaps not in practice, but possibly in principle, you could have slaves working on a boat catching sustainable fish. This raises the broader question of living conditions and working conditions and pay for tens of thousands of fishers. And largely they are the least unionized kind of sector in the world and have they have the most dangerous job in the world. So the recent example of an investigation in Thailand found that largely Burmese and other people from Southeast Asia were working in slave-like conditions. So these kind of economic migrants who are already highly vulnerable, escaping a military dictatorship, were then captured by local business people and made to work like slaves on boats. So what we need to do is to open up the concept of sustainability beyond the current kind of Western kind of supermarket focus on the environment to also include the working conditions on the boats. The big emphasis in the media and in kind of recent campaigns, so for example Fish Fight on Channel 4, has been on line-caught tuna. And that's literally, you have a group of men, largely men, at the back of a boat, each with a single rod, and you create a feeding frenzy, and they all just have a hook and a line, and they dip the hook into the water and haul the fish on board. Line-caught fishing is much more labour-intensive, and as a result it creates a lot more jobs. But the problem is that it cannot produce the same volume of fish which consumers kind of demand. So there is a tension between the kind of commitments to the sustainable, environmentally sustainable commitments and the reality on the ground. The problem is that we tend to focus on eating, one or two species like cod or tuna and salmon and so on, and we need to diversify our consumption. But on top of that, when we do that, we also have to be aware of the ecosystem effects of the new sources of consumption. A lot of people talk about aquaculture, for example, like farmed fish as being the future. But very often farmed fish itself is fed with other wild fish. So you catch, for example, tuna, and the byproduct is the bones and so on is kind of broken up into fish meal, which are then fed to chickens and possibly other fish. So there's this kind of food web producing the aquaculture, which may mean that it itself is not necessarily as sustainable as everyone thinks it is.